Hello, welcome to the last session of week 7 of our course on Marketing Management 1. We have been discussing this week different aspects of market segmentation and targeting. Today, I would like to take up few specific or particular issues relating to this segmentation and targeting, and I would like to end today's session with a discussion on how to use this segmentation and targeting in implementing a good marketing strategy. The first topic is that when we talk about segmentation, in a wide market we sort of take a particular segment. What is a segment? How do we identify a segment? All these we have discussed in the previous sessions. On this screen what you see is an illustration that the segmentation can also be at various levels, or it can go to various depths. For example, on the left hand side you see what we normally call segmentation, but then within a segment there can be further sub segments or a very thin slice of a very interesting segment that we often call a niche segment. So, for example, there is a segment of luxury car buyers. Now, within that luxury car buyer segment, we can have a segment of customers who may be few in number, but they may be particularly looking for a very high feature car with lots of facilities, with a 4-wheel drive which will be used for adventure oriented long drives. So, for going on a forest trail, for going on a hilly terrain, for a sort of adventure trip, this car will have not only the usual car features or ruggedness, but will also have various kinds of luxury into it and various kind of features with respect to maybe direction finding, with respect to communication, with respect to entertainment and so on. Now, such a car which combines different types of attributes from maybe other segments. So, it may borrow music from a sporty car, or it can borrow high torque capability from a sporty car and so on. In combination, it appeals to a small group of customers called niche segment, who may have enough paying capacity that even though the number of units sold in this market will be low, but the per unit value can be high to make that particular segment lucrative and attractive for a company which can match that sort of design requirement, that sort of feature requirement. We can also have segments which are like what we have here is a segment called localized segment. So, this kind of localized segmentation is often done, for example, in entertainment, like a Hollywood movie may be dubbed in 6 Indian languages and might be edited to some extent for garnering a localized market. This is also done with respect to flavor in food items. So, for example, or in response to certain regulatory or cultural reasoning. So, for example, McDonald's might segment in a localized manner their burger market and offer mutton instead of beef in responding to the sentiments in a particular country. And lastly, we have this newly emerging segment which is sometimes called the long tail phenomenon and this one-to-one segment. That means today actually because of the internet and various other kinds of information communication technology tools that are available, we can cater to a particular high value market segment which may have very few members. So, for example, in collection of curios or collection of stamps, for example postal stamps, this is a hobby market, and here there can be two buyers looking for one particular stamp to complete his or her collection, and they may be prepared to pay premium value, and this market can be addressed by somebody who has that stamp to sell, and they can connect at a very low cost using the communication tools. And that is why there are number of different types of very small number of customers appealing to a number of sellers accessed through the internet or other communication media. So, if you go to eBay or similar websites, you will see this one-to-one market in action. So, market segments therefore can be defined in various different ways as we have been discussing, and I will take a specific example to show graphically what are the different types of segmentation strategies that can be followed. Take for example ice cream. Now, we can define ice cream by two major customer preference attributes. One can be the creaminess of ice cream and another can be the sweetness or flavor. As a result, if we can actually look at the whole ice cream market, we will see emerging patterns. In some cases it can be diffused, in some cases it can be clustered, and there can be homogeneous preference. So, vanilla ice cream, which is a most popular flavor and has a certain standard of sweetness, because this is the base ice cream that is often used with fruit salad or additives like coffee are added to it or chocolate sauce is added. So, this vanilla ice cream therefore actually represents a kind of a homogeneous preference and all buyers have similar preferences. But from there actually the opposite to this is the diffused, that means there is no particular pattern that is emerging. This happens in case of many food products where there can be a very wide variety, and so even in ice cream it can happen that there is each flavor has a small group of following and there is a huge scattering. So, this is a kind of a market which is addressing this sort of market. By only this kind of market is often not very practical. So, what we look for is from this kind of distribution, we try to look this kind of distribution where we can we cluster them together. So, there may be customers who prefer ice cream with cake, the cake ice cream. Now, we try to find different ways of putting them together, then we find that okay, if we have one layer of vanilla cake with one layer of some kind of chocolate ice cream and one layer of XYZ flavor, we then can create a certain kind of a clustering like this. So, on that same scale of creaminess versus sweetness, we can then get market segments which are addressable in a practical sense. So, niche segment, sub segments are also quite visible in case of say washing detergents. We have detergents which are good in cleaning, but they may not be very hand friendly. So, there can be detergents which are very friendly towards, that means they are not at all rough, but they may not be good for very hard cleaning, cleaning of highly soiled clothes, etc. So, there can be different requirements, there can be requirement for light wash, there can be requirement for heavy wash, there can be requirement for machine wash, there can be requirement for industrial or institutional wash, like a laundry in a large hotel or in a hospital, and accordingly we can have different kinds of detergents, whether it is the easy soft detergent from Godrej or Surf Excel for hard cleaning on tough stains, and that is how you see we have this different clusters or sub segments emerging. Similarly, for example, for TV channel focusing on religion and spirituality, we can have focusing on Christian religion, focusing on yoga and good practices, focusing on art of everyday life and principled living, management of our own life based on ethics, and on that basis you can create different kinds of bouquets of programs, and that is a kind of a clustering that we create to attend to respond to the needs of a particular type of consumer segment. So, for example, Rolls-Royce is an example of niche market. Few, as I was discussing a little while back, a very high end car, high value, but few are sold, yet it is a viable market, because while the per unit demand is limited, per unit value is very high or could be even approaching unlimited. Local market, for example, in dress material like katha sari, a particular type of style of weaving and embroidering in eastern region, particularly Bengal, create a sort of a local merchandise which can have local appeal as well as global appeal. Same goes for something like Kashmiri silk, and this we see also in beverages, whether it is champagne or Scotch whisky or Darjeeling tea, and so on. So, these are interesting segments that are local in nature in terms of sourcing and in terms of constituent, but it can often have very wide global appeal. And as I was mentioning, Hollywood movies are often they use techniques to cater to local markets, local language markets, and individual market is what is this one-to-one market that we discussed. And sometimes within the one-to-one market there is a particular emerging area called customerization. So, this is a technique that is being used by Asian Paints or Nerolac, Berger Paint, etc. quite successfully, where the customer can go to a paint distributor and by combining the basic shades can create n number of different hues, different subtle variants suiting a particular family's preferences. And or for example, Arvind Mill, they launched this rough and tough jeans, where a piece of cloth and a fabric, jeans, denim fabric, along with all the stitching material, buttons, etc., all came in one packet, which you could then get tailored by your local tailor. So, it was a very nice example of mass manufacturing combined with customization, creating a special sort of value proposition and a marketing success. So, what is happening in the paint market today for domestic paint, where the customer can at the dealers or distributors place or even at his or her residence can create absolutely personalized paint shade suiting the family requirement of that particular shade may be sold once in a year, but even then today's technology and computers and communication compatibility enable paint companies to store therefore at their dealers the basic colors and enable the technology to play to create these n number of different customer preferential responses. So, this is something that we might see more and more. We might see new techniques where that rough and tough genes of Arvind, we might see that how internet gets blended with it, and you can therefore sit in your own office or in your at your home in front of the camera, and your picture can be transmitted to say jeans manufacturer and your photograph from different angles, and they can therefore take your body type measurements etc., extract it from those images, and then you can choose your material and you can choose your color and all that, and they can send you across a tailored made to order dress, which a trouser, a shirt, where the buyer and the seller have never met physically. This kind of new applications of customization using technology, creating profitable one-to-one marketing, we will see more and more in the coming years. I am going to now discuss another kind of segmentation which we have discussed briefly, but I am now going to present to you a very important construction of that, and that is called this VALS, value and lifestyle. So, here as you see, this is a kind of segmentation technique, the psychological and aspirational and mental type of, we call it the psychographic segmentation, and we often combine it with demographic segmentation. So, as you see here, we have the population divided from the lower point to the upper point. This is somewhat borrowed from Maslow's hierarchy of needs and other such models of understanding people and their preferences and their priorities. So, you have at the very bottom people who are strugglers. So, these are people who are economically just getting better. Their emphasis will be on products and services which relate to subsistence, which relate to food, clothing, etc. And then as you go upwards, you have people who are looking for different kinds of emotional satisfaction, association satisfaction, esteem satisfaction, self actualization and so on. These percentages are taken from certain studies. The numbers may slightly vary from country to country or region to region, but more or less it has been found that this kind of pattern is there, and the numbers are not so important. Important are these different categories of psychological profiles, which when combined with demographic can give us certain type of market segments. Say for example, we know that there are more and more senior citizens who compared to earlier years now have their own comfortable disposable income profile. So, they are able to spend money for their own pleasant experiences. So, as a result we have, and these are the people who can be generally called fulfilled or experiencer. That means they have all kinds of material stuff, they are not interested in shirts or trousers or sarees or jewelry. They are people who at this stage of life may be looking for pleasant experiences or experiences which they value, and as a result we can therefore now create a market which is say for grandparents who want to travel to meet with their grandchildren. So, it is a they can create packages, or it can be senior citizens looking for pilgrimage, or senior citizens looking for controlled adventure, or people who are achievers, but they also they have very they are very busy successful executives, but they also know that there is a need for relaxation, and so there can be very well planned meticulous holidays which aim at relaxation. So, you have spa holidays or you have resort holidays coming up, and you can therefore create product and service packages exactly aimed at this. So, it actually combines therefore age or education or income level etc. type of demographic segmentation which we have discussed before, with different kinds of psychological preferences and psychological state of need, and combining you create more richer segments. So, to this particular slide gives you the 4 major ways: geographic, demographic, psychographic, product related, which we have already discussed. We will now conclude this session today by discussing through the discussion of how we use segmentation for strategy creation and implementation in the marketing field. So, the stage 1 is to identify the segmentation process which will be most valid in that particular scenario, then develop relevant profile, then a very important one, this perhaps we will discuss a little bit more next week, that how do you then forecast the market potential for that particular segment. After all, if the segment is not large enough or the segment is not growing fast enough, then it may not be of interest to us. So, that is why this forecasting that what is the size of that market and what market share we can get are very important for selecting and deploying a particular segmentation based marketing strategy. Identifying segmentation are either done through this combined study of behavioral and demographic characteristics of likely users, or segmentations can also be done by looking at products and services, the key attributes, and matching with customers to whom those attributes are important. So, it can come through some kind of response survey and clustering of those responses or so on. Then we try to develop a profile. This is a very important one. We also call it persona development. That is, we do not think of this is a key point, that if we only think of markets as 25 to 35-year-old busy executive, we may make some wrong decisions. It is much better that you take an actual person, draw the narrative around an actual person of 25 to 35-year-old, a busy executive, track his or her daily life, track his or her dreams and aspirations, track his or her likes and dislikes, and thereby create a storyboard, we call it mood board, storyboard, persona. All these terminologies finally are basically to understand that segments are not numbers, segments are people. So, you therefore try to understand the nature of that segment in terms of a narrative of a particular person. And then of course, once we have done and we have understood the nature of that particular segment, then we have to also see that how big is that market segment. That is an important, we often call it that what is the total market. From the total market we try to understand the subset which is the total addressable market. That means, if you have a product or service, if you have a particular type of detergent which is very good for removing stains etc., and it's very good for sale in the hotel or restaurant market, then you have to then follow that with an estimation that okay, there can be millions of hotels around the world, but you are going to start your business in Mumbai. So, then your market sizing will depend on where you start, or sometimes this market sizing can be wider in terms of geography, but it can be very specific in terms of the profile of customer you are going to address first. So, you here for example, in this detergent example, you are going to start in a B2B fashion. Once you have established the credential of that particular product in that sort of environment, you can create a spin-off which will then address the B2C or consumer market for tough stains, food stains and so on. And then of course, yesterday if you remember, we had looked at that orthogonal structure where you look at the market attractiveness and your own corporate competitiveness or competencies. These are factors which are to be combined to understand that what can be your market share. This obviously will need answering questions like why will anybody buy your detergent. So, all your uniqueness, all your unique selling proposition, distinctiveness, features etc., will come into the picture, and then they will, you have to understand that how many people are aware of or what is your strategy of making people aware, and then you have to find out that what is the way you will involve more and more people in trying out your new detergent or your new ready to cook soup. This estimation of the market share and the size of the market we may discuss a little bit more, but obviously the definition of a segment depends on this kind of quantification. So, this is important, and once we have that, then we know how according to different priority, we discussed that yesterday, that today if your company is in need of free cash flow, then you will select that particular opportunity, that particular segment or product market fit which may be low in profitability, but much better in cash flow, and thereby you will actually make your segmentation choice. Once you have this kind of selection made, then what you see here is the different approach that you can take. So, undifferentiated marketing, when actually we have a very diffused and widespread or a product which has appealed to multiple different segments, we use undifferentiated marketing. So, if we are marketing say bottled water will be required by different kind of people. So, we then may be focusing just on the property of the product and arrange them in such a way that appeal will be made to a wide variety of customers. We may only play with the sizing or the bottle structure etc., but the value proposition remains the same, it is good, healthy drinking water, and marketing can be therefore in a way undifferentiated. Obviously, a place which is famous for the quality of its water, say some of the cities in Europe or some of the cities in Asia, where people would like to drink from the river or from the spring, selling bottled water may have to have different value proposition. But earlier otherwise these are examples of widely promoted products appealing to a large number of customers. As opposed to that, we can have micro marketing aimed at a particular niche, or differentiated marketing where we very distinctly say that this product is meant for high end luxury customers like the buyers for Rolls-Royce car. Or sometimes we can do very concentrated marketing, this is often used for say for movies or other events which are coming up and transient, or even we do it for perishable items which are seasonal items, will be there only for few weeks. So, in all these cases we will do what is called concentrated marketing. So, as you see here that depending on the type of market segment you are addressing and the characteristics of that segment in terms of time, longevity, spread, geographical spread, depth and all that, you will adopt one of these quadrants. So, undifferentiated marketing is you produce only one product or product line and you want to promote it to all customers with a single marketing mix. So, sometimes we call it mass marketing. And incidentally, today's market is such that we are seeing lesser and lesser number of mass marketing items and more number of differentiated marketing items. So, earlier we sold tea just as Assam tea and Darjeeling tea. Today in Assam tea we have different varieties. We have CTC variety, leaf variety, mix of the two, mixed with herbal ingredients like clove, etc., masala chai, all kinds of differentiated marketing based on the basic black tea or Assam tea. In the flavored tea, earlier we had this Darjeeling tea, but today within that we have the first flush, the second flush, the golden tip and various other kinds of mix of Darjeeling tea with tulsi and Darjeeling tea with certain other kinds of healthy herbs and so on. So, obviously it means that the company, the tea company will then produce numerous products and you will have to promote them with different kind of marketing mix or mix of value proposition. It means we are positioning ourselves to satisfy multiple segments. So, it is very cleverly and with lot of care we will have to decide how we are positioning the product brands and the corporate brand and the relationship. So, differentiated marketing is therefore often practiced by companies like HUL and Procter and Gamble, and you can study their marketing strategy deeply and see how they support both the product as well as the house or the corporate name brand in a way that they help each other. Concentrated marketing or niche marketing, we discussed number of different examples, and there can be more examples of this also with respect to events or products which last for a short time. Micro marketing, we discussed certain examples like a very high end luxury car, etc., but also there are very interesting scientific or institutional markets that can be cited as example here. And as I mentioned, internet and other communication technologies make micro marketing now practical and feasible which would have been very difficult. So, this is an example where some kind of genetic solution is being marketed, and you can address through a proper media strategy and communication strategy customers who may be widely spread around the world, but yet very keen to get something like this. So, selecting and executing a strategy, marketing strategy will be our main theme next week, based on all the different things that we have discussed in the last few weeks regarding the nature of the customer, nature of the consumer, nature of the market, the behavior of people in a marketing or buying selling situation. By this time you must be understanding that there is no single the best strategy. It is contextual, it depends on the situation, it depends on the product, it depends on the service, it depends on the size of the market, it depends on the geography of the market, it depends on the culture of the market. Determinant of a good strategy will depend on your internal factors like your own competencies, your own resources, the nature of the product or service that you want to market, and the stage in the product life cycle, the competition, and so on.